The events take place in 1980. A man arrived at his house, located on the outskirts of the city. With each passing second his anxiety grew. Inside was only his daughter, whom the man had taken from this place. Next the events take us back a little in time. Catherine and George Clare threw a party to celebrate their daughter Franny's birthday. She had just turned 4. Friends noted how thin Catherine was. She in turn made sure that all the guests were satisfied. Without finishing her piece of cake, Catherine went to the bathroom and rinsed her stomach. Then everyone raised a toast to Dr. George. He had recently defended his dissertation and got a job upstate, at a college in Saginaw. The family would soon be moving. Catherine didn't want to leave her good job in New York. After all her friends and family were here. But ever since George's father stopped financially supporting them, things had gotten worse. Catherine worked as an art restorer. Soon George told his wife that he had found the perfect house for them. Without wasting time, the family moved. Real estate agent Mara showed them a house built at the end of the 19th century. Though it needed repairs inside, the house looked sturdy. Catherine wondered why the previous owners had left such a beautiful place. George replied that it was tough times for the farming business. The couple believed that here, far from the hustle and bustle of the city, they could start a new life. Gradually the family settled into the house. As a restorer, Catherine paid attention to every little detail. One day she found an old journal with sheet music. Catherine hoped that her husband would regain his inspiration here and start painting again. George replied that it was unlikely. After the dissertation, he felt more like a writer. In the evening after putting their daughter to bed, the couple also prepared for sleep. Tomorrow was George's first day at work, but he wasn't the least bit worried. The nightlight in Franny's room began to flicker. At the same time Catherine smelled exhaust fumes. When objects started moving on their own, Franny ran screaming into the parents' room. The next morning, George started his new job and met his department chair, Floyd De Beers. They discussed art. Floyd believed that everything in addition to its natural form, also had a spiritual essence. George was shown his new office. Catherine was very concerned about her weight, fearing she would gain it. She was scared of this house, where objects could move on their own. Suddenly there was a knock at the door. Standing on the doorstep were Eddie Vale and his younger brother Cole. They had come to introduce themselves in case the new residents of the town needed workers. The brothers could do it all. Cole immediately hit it off with Franny. It turned out that the brothers lived with their uncle. Catherine asked Eddie for a business card. The guy said he'd forgotten them at home but could leave his phone number. That evening over dinner, Catherine told her husband that they should hire these guys because their rates were lower than the others. George was concerned that his wife was barely eating anything. Recently the doctor had prescribed her protein shakes. After dinner in the kitchen, Catherine found an old book containing records of previous house residents and curses. Catherine wanted to tell her husband about it, but he was already asleep. While doing the dishes, Catherine saw reflections of light on the jars sitting on the kitchen shelves. This was how Catherine discovered an antique ring. Something sinister was clearly going on in this house. The next day, Catherine met with representatives of the Historical Society. Catherine was interested in the history of her home. It turned out the house had been depicted in one of the paintings. In the 19th century, it was owned by a local couple. Bored George started flirting with a student, Willis, who was studying literature. Eddie, by the way, was her friend. The girl knew the professor was married. She kept her distance but didn't mind the flirting. Franny and Cole became good friends. Eddie, as the older one, watched over them. Catherine, clearly lacking social interaction here, was glad for Eddie's attention. He shared that their uncle was a hearse driver. Their parents perished in a car accident many years ago. Catherine was very sorry to hear that. Eddie had to grow up quickly. Unlike him, Cole would have the chance to go to college. Eddie also shared that he loved music. Catherine mentioned that they have a piano in their house, and it would be wonderful to hear someone who could play. Thanks to his charisma, George was popular with students, especially the girls. During a break, Justine Sokolova, a weaving instructor, approached him and expressed her admiration. George had already become a cult figure in their department. George gladly accepted Justine's invitation to meet their families. When Justine asked about his paintings, George said he didn't consider himself talented. At night, Catherine couldn't sleep again due to the strange smell that would come and go. However, George didn't see it as a problem. Catherine couldn't stand it anymore and went to check what was going on. Meanwhile, something supernatural started happening in Franny's room again. Catherine checked all the appliances in the house. Suddenly her attention was drawn to music coming from the living room. As expected, there was no one at the piano. Seeing the silhouette of a woman, Franny screamed. Catherine began to comfort the daughter. She was sure the problem was with the house, but George didn't take it seriously. That night, Eddie and Willis were having fun together. Willis shared that she had recently seen George Clare, and he gave her the impression of being a deceitful man. The next day while Eddie was working, Cole played with Franny. Catherine found a book in the husband's private room that said we are all connected on earth with people in the spiritual world who resemble us. George regularly went jogging to stay in shape. Suddenly he saw Willis, who cared for horses at the local racing club in her free time. George was drawn to this student, who called him an arrogant rascal. But this didn't offend George in the slightest, and he followed Willis. Catherine called her mother, sharing that she missed socializing with people. Moreover, something was definitely going on in the house. The mother advised Catherine to go to church. Catherine couldn't share all her thoughts with the husband. She couldn't stop thinking about the antique ring. Catherine put it on her finger. Eddie and Cole met George in person for the first time. Unlike his wife, George knew that the Vale brothers had once lived in this house. George asked them not to mention this to Catherine, as she was a very impressionable woman. Later, Eddie asked Catherine about how she met her husband. She said they met at university. In return, Eddie shared that his mother had encouraged his love of music, unlike his father. Catherine promised to write him a check if he decided to attend music school. She drew his portrait. That evening after work, seeing Eddie play the piano for Catherine, George was displeased but tried not to show it. Then Catherine accidentally dropped the ring in the sink and tried to retrieve it, hooking her finger on something disgusting. It turned out to be just a nightmare. Franny still couldn't sleep because of the strange things happening in her room. In the morning, Catherine discovered that her husband had left early. George had started an affair with Willis, who felt guilty. She had previously promised herself not to get involved with men like George. The girl decided to break up with him. As planned, George and his wife visited Justine and her husband Bram. The couple ran a small farm here. Bram shared with George that he had moved here to write a great novel, but instead spent most of his time tending to the farm. Catherine was impressed by Justine's work, who viewed weaving as a spiritual process. Justine and Bram didn't have children. At first they were hesitant about it for a long time, and then it didn't work out anymore. Catherine in turn shared that she wasn't ready for marriage and motherhood, but everything worked itself out. The first years after Franny's birth were like a blur. When Justine invited Catherine to attend a creative women's club with her, she gladly accepted. For her, it was a great chance to meet new people. On the way back, George expressed the opinion that Bram was lazy because he inherited a large fortune and could afford not to write a book. But Catherine liked this family, especially Justine, who had a light attitude about everything. Drunk George began speeding and laughing, which angered his wife. The couple had a conflict. Catherine screamed at her husband, saying she sacrificed everything for him. George saw this as nothing more than drunken tears. In his view, Catherine shouldn't drink at all, given how little she eats. Catherine was tired of hearing that her life's problems were all due to undernourishment. In a fit of anger, George pushed the wife, and she fell. He was very sorry, but Catherine didn't want to hear any apologies. Cole had been watching Franny the whole time. After dropping him off at home, George found his wife sleeping in their daughter's room. George really didn't want to hurt Catherine. He sincerely regretted his actions, fearing he would lose the family. Suddenly the nightlight shattered, waking Franny. Catherine still didn't say a word to her husband. Soon after, she went to the Creative Women's Club with Justine, where many interesting ideas were discussed. Today Catherine didn't bother with making dinner. George didn't know how to reconcile with his wife, and late in the evening left the house, crossing paths with Justine, who had earlier given Catherine a ride home. Later, he went sailing with Floyd. George used to have his own yacht, which he inherited from a cousin who drowned. This incident clearly demonstrated how unfair life can be. In the evening, George invited Floyd over. He was glad to meet Catherine. When he brought up the topic of the spiritual world, George cut in, saying his wife wasn't the best conversation partner on such matters, asking her to show the guest around the house. At one point, Floyd told Catherine that they weren't alone here. This entity wishes no harm to anyone and wants to help. Catherine knew what he meant. She also felt the presence of a woman. Catherine hugged Floyd, who was the only one who understood her. The woman's last name was Smith, and she was the wife of Reverend Jacob Smith. This had been their home. Floyd promised Catherine he would try to find more information in the university library. He also suggested holding a séance in the house later. After thanking the hosts for a wonderful evening, he left. George was glad that his wife had made a good impression on the department chair. Perhaps they should throw a big party at the house. And so they did. At the party were George's colleagues and many town residents. Cole made sure all the guests had wine, while Eddie played the piano. Floyd introduced Catherine to his wife, Millicent, who also believed in the supernatural. George invited Justine to step outside for a smoke. The real estate agent Mara mentioned that Eddie and Cole had grown up in this house, assuming Catherine was aware. Mara had originally told George about it. Catherine was shocked and demanded Mara explain what had happened. Ella Vale, The boy's mother was Mara's friend and suffered from her abusive husband. One day he blew exhaust fumes into the house through the garage, taking his and his wife's lives. The boys were unharmed. Catherine realized why she kept smelling something strange in the house. Catherine couldn't believe the husband had hidden the truth from her. That antique ring had belonged to Ella. Perhaps it was her spirit in the house, not Mrs. Smith. Meanwhile, George was chatting with Justine outside, openly flirting. He knew how to charm women. But when George became too pushy, Justine didn't like it. George just laughed. When the party ended, Catherine was washing dishes, answering the pleased husband's questions in monosyllables. George didn't understand why his wife had withdrawn into herself again. At that moment, Catherine couldn't stand it and said that she knew the truth about the house. George tried to convince his wife that he only wanted to make her happy. Their argument was interrupted by the radio, which turned on by itself and started emitting eerie noises. Even when George unplugged it, that didn't help. He had to smash the radio. Catherine didn't look surprised, she simply told her husband to spend the rest of the weekend with Franny at his parents' house. Catherine found an article online about Ella Vale's demise and called Floyd, telling him she was ready for the seance. He and his group arrived. Floyd had already gathered some information about the first owners of the house. Jacob was an ardent Calvinist and condemned his wife's philosophy. At the age of 26, she passed away under strange circumstances in this house. Floyd and his colleagues reassured Catherine that whatever spirit resided in the house wasn't evil, because evil spirits only communicate with evildoers. And Catherine didn't seem like a bad person. The seance began. The candles in the room went out, and objects started moving on their own. The spirit had come to them. A woman's voice begged for help. Everything ended as quickly as it began. Floyd concluded that there was another spirit in the house, and its intentions were still unclear. After the weekend, George and Franny returned. George accompanied the students on a field trip. As it turned out, Justine was also there. Catherine decided to give Ella's ring to her eldest son, Eddie. But the young man said he wanted Catherine to keep the ring because she was a good person. Catherine hugged Eddie. Later, she went to the library to return the husband's books. It turned out that one of the books had been checked out under Willis's name. The librarian said she knew this girl. Catherine went to the bank and opened an account, but not a joint one with her husband. During the field trip, George kept his eyes on Justine. Here he crossed paths with his academic advisor from New York, Dr. Warren. The professor wondered how George had been hired as a lecturer without any recommendations. George awkwardly replied that he was only temporarily filling in for another professor. Justine overheard the conversation and understood the point. Before bed, George told his wife that he didn't like her associating with Justine because there were unsavory rumors about her. Catherine reacted indifferently. The next day, Floyd told George that Dr. Shelby Warren from Columbia University had called him. This was how Floyd found out that George had forged the recommendation letter. Using all his charm, George tried to convince the department chair to give him a chance to explain. His whole family was coming over today, and he didn't want to ruin the weekend. In the end, Floyd agreed to postpone the conversation for a few days. That evening, the Clare family had a dinner. While George was in the kitchen carving the turkey, the conversation at the table turned to his cousin Henry, who had been a talented artist and loved painting seascapes before the tragic yacht accident. After Henry's demise, all his paintings mysteriously disappeared. These words horrified Catherine. Could her husband have taken his late cousin's paintings for himself? Knocking over her glass of wine, Catherine left the table. In the bathroom, she rinsed her stomach. When George entered, Catherine told him she was sick of their marriage. Suddenly the bathroom door closed on its own. As George left, he didn't notice the silhouette of a woman in the corner. That night, whispers filled the house asking for help. Due to the rift with his wife, George had to sleep in his car. The difficult conversation with the department chair was approaching. However, seeing Floyd through the window, George followed him to the pier. Floyd invited George to join him on a yacht trip and discuss everything at the same time. Seeing Catherine in tears, Eddie asked what had happened. Although the young man already guessed that it had to do with George. His father had been the same way. Suddenly Catherine kissed Eddie, passion ignited between them. Meanwhile, George told Floyd about his complicated relationship with Shelby at Columbia. Floyd explained that falsifications, regardless of the reasons, were unacceptable. Tomorrow Floyd intended to report this to Human Resources, which meant George would lose his job. Floyd truly felt sorry, but it was his duty. At a cafe, Justine noticed a scarf of her own making on Willis. It was a scarf she had made to order from John, supposedly for his mother. George was returning home late in the evening, soaked to the bone. On the street in this state, he was spotted by Justine, who declared that she knew the whole truth about him. Now Justine was determined to tell Catherine everything and headed toward her house. At some point, Justine realized she was being followed. Another car began ramming her and eventually pushed her off the road. Catherine wanted to have a serious talk with her husband, but he claimed to be feeling unwell. Catherine told George to sleep downstairs tonight. That night, a raven broke the bedroom window, scaring Catherine. George told his wife to have her boyfriend fix the window in the morning. Catherine woke up to a phone call. George was already awake, watching as his wife quickly got into her car and drove off. George called Cole, asking him to come early today. Then George went to the pharmacy and bought some sedatives, supposedly for his daughter's night terrors. Catherine was in the ward with Bram. Justine had fallen into a coma, and the doctors didn't know if she would wake up. On the way back, Catherine heard on the radio about the demise of 66-year-old Professor Floyd De Beers. It had been a yacht accident. At the university, George pretended to be shocked by the news. According to the official version, Floyd had suffered a heart attack and fallen overboard. George was offered the position of interim department chair. Of course he accepted. George was about to break the sad news to the students when he suddenly noticed that the slides on the projector were displaying paintings of his late cousin. At first George thought it was a bad joke by one of the students. Then he immediately left the university and drove home, noticing packed bags in the wife's car. At home, George asked her why she hadn't drunk her protein shake again. Catherine pretended everything was fine. However, George knew she was planning to leave him. Entering the daughter's room, George demanded to know why Franny was already dressed in outdoor clothes. George grabbed Catherine. She broke free and tried to call someone, but the husband didn't let her. Their fight spilled over to the outside. Catherine screamed at George that she knew he was involved in the demise of his cousin and Floyd, as well as Justine's car crash. Of course George denied this, yelling back at his wife that she was going crazy because of her constant dieting. At some point Catherine felt unbearable weakness, realizing that the husband had put something in her protein shake. She fought with all her might against the weakness, calling for help. Despite everything, Catherine managed to get back into the house. The ghost of Ella accompanied her, giving her strength. However, Catherine was too late. Franny was no longer in the room. Ella, who had once suffered at the hands of a tyrannical husband, wanted to prevent the same thing from happening to Catherine, but another ghost was trying to stop her. Catherine finally lost consciousness. George, crying, entered the room with an axe in hand. The ghost of Jacob Smith was whispering to him that he had to get rid of his wife. In the morning, Cole as usual came to the house and found a letter from George, stating that Catherine had fallen ill. During the day Cole looked after Franny, and in the evening he went home. At work, George tried to act as if nothing had happened. In the evening, he went with his daughter to their neighbor Pat's house and asked him to call the sheriff. Later, George brought the sheriff to the house where the night before something terrible had clearly occurred. Lifeless Catherine lay in the bedroom. George insisted that someone had broken into their home. The news was all over the media. Willis felt guilty, believing she could have prevented the tragedy. George was questioned and then released. Eddie showed up at the police station to talk to the sheriff. George's parents planned to hire the best lawyer for him. They intended to leave for Connecticut in the morning. Eddie was convinced that George was directly involved in the wife's demise, but he had no proof. The sheriff's wife also believed George was responsible. But Travis couldn't arrest him yet, as more evidence was needed. That house was clearly cursed. Hearing Catherine's voice in her head, Justine came out of her coma. Meanwhile, George played the role of the grieving husband. Upon learning that Justine had come out of her coma, he realized his alibi was starting to fall apart. George still believed that he had always deserved more, but those around him had never properly acknowledged his efforts. He was going to escape on a yacht. Even in her ward, Justine continued her weaving. When the sheriff came, she told him the whole truth. George got caught in a storm, hearing otherworldly whispers that said those who sow evil will be punished and cursed. The water around seemed to be engulfed in flames, just as depicted in one of Henry's paintings. By the way, the ring originally belonged to the first lady of the house, Mrs. Smith.